Thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this. As you know, like students in my course on Indian philosophy were requesting for your sessions. But by the time we could reach out to you, the course is over and they're actually going through the exams. However, due to Dr. Devdutt Pattanaik's help, I could reach out to you. Thank you very much. So all of us know that you are probably an extremely well-known writer of our time, and possibly the only one who illustrates the relevance of mythology in modern times. I don't know anybody from my side, at least. So you have written many books and hundreds of columns on of how stories, symbols, and rituals they construct the myths of ancient and modern cultures around the world. So today's topic is Business Sutra. How does culture impact business? So the floor is open. I don't want to spend more time introducing you because I'm sure all of you, all the people here know you better than I know. So thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I will speak and I'll keep looking at the chat box because that will sort of give me an indicator of what's going on. 1 minute, I'm just trying to see it. Yeah. So I can see there are quite a few people who have joined. So the chat box is through which I will communicate because I think I'm seeing only 1 or 2 people on video. I always begin sessions like this by asking people to send me questions. The reason is because when you read the questions, you understand how people see Indian philosophy or how they see Indian mythology. And I saw these questions and none of them dealt with business. So they were all dealing with, the first question was, what is dharma in the context of business? Is dharma righteousness only? So there's an assumption of the meaning of the word dharma. Is it objective or subjective? Then there is, how is it relevant to the teachings of Bhagavad Gita? Then the third question was to do with Draupadi's situation in Sabha Parva. I'm still trying to figure out how that is related to business. And then the fifth question was, what is your favorite episode from the Mahabharata? And the fourth question was interesting. It was about marginalized communities representation in Mahabharata and Ramayana. And, basically what it struck me, and one of the reasons I write on Business Sutra is because what has happened from childhood and because of how we are taught Indian philosophy and what is the approach to whether it's the epics, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Purans, the Vedas. Most people have not actually read it, and we usually present them in the form of stories for children, and we keep using words like good values. Now, a good scholarship is when you start asking fundamental questions about what do these words mean, where do they come from, and it's important to understand this. Otherwise, these stories do not make sense. So historically, the idea of mythology came from European countries. And European countries in the 19th century started using this word mythology to explain the stories, symbols, and rituals that they encountered in the colonies. Now, in the 19th century, Europe was facing a challenge. They were around 300-400 years ago, science as we know it emerged in Europe. And science in its finest form, which is based, and it had a very simple logic. They said, science is based on a very simple principle. It says, not on anyone's word. That means nullius in verba. That's the sentence in Latin, which basically means that I do not take anyone's word for it. Anything which I have to experiment it, I need evidence of it. It has to be outside the human mind. And that is the great contribution of what we call modern science. Modern science is based on doubt, and it is not based on faith. No matter how smart you are, no matter how intelligent you are, no matter who you are, no matter what statement you make, I need evidence for it, and I have to do an experiment with it. That is how science emerged. Now, this is the very opposite of religions, which is based on faith, and what in Sanskrit is called Shabda Praman. If the guru says so, it is true. So, for example, we are told Adi Shankaracharya was a great philosopher, but a scientist will ask why. Why is he a great philosopher? And you'll say, no, his ideas are great. But I said, why are those ideas great? And this kind of questioning can come across as very scary to people because they seem to be very intrusive. And that's the nature of science. It's very intrusive. It asks very foundational questions about what is right, what is wrong, what is basic. And that is how physics, chemistry, biology, botany, zoology, these subjects emerged. And they started using this approach to understand, to figure out how do people, how does the world function? And science came into conflict with religion. Roughly around this 200-300 years ago, you see this great fight between science and religion. And the difference is very simple. Religion is based on faith. Religion is based on the word of the guru, while science is not based on the word of the guru and it is based on doubt. And that's the foundational thing. The problem with European scientists is that they were more comfortable analyzing the religions which were outside Europe. So they were very comfortable analyzing American myths, African myths, Indian myths. They use the word myth, and the word myth comes from a Greek word called mythos, which means stories. They did not apply it to the Bible, even though Bible is full of stories. They applied it to some degree with the Quran, but they generally avoided applying it to their own stories. And this is where problems emerged, because the question of what is true became contentious. So is religion telling you the truth? Or is science telling you the truth? And even today, when you go to America, you will find large numbers of people challenging scientific ideas like creationism. We have these ideas called creationism, and rather than evolution, which comes from a scientific thought. And you find this around the world. There is a great tension between religious truth and scientific truths. And that applies to business also. So how is a business successful? And if you apply to business, what is business? Is business born? Now, let's ask ourselves, let's look at, when we talk about business today, what are successful business houses? And you'll notice that all successful business houses have very strong religious grounding. And for example, you will see them connected with some religious group. So Babajis, Gurujis are a very important part of the business makeup. Like a study should be done, and you will notice that if you just do a Google search and say Sadhguru net worth, and you will get $50 million. You do Nityanand and Swami Nityanand or Sri Ravi Shankar, and you'll find their net worth is very, 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 very high. And why is that? Is that because, and this is where we realize the power of religion. Religion deals with emotional truths, human insecurities, human fears, and that science cannot handle. So when you put your money in the stock market and you're talking about a risk-reward ratio, you've put your money in the market, you're very insecure. You don't know whether the money will go in your favor, whether your loan will be passed, whether the investor will agree to invest in your business. How do you cope with that insecurity? Is there a rational method or are there irrational methods? So some will say, hey, go to therapy. Some will say take alcohol. Some will say take drinks. Others will say go to a Guruji, go to a temple. And there are these different models. And what happens when you suddenly things work out in your favor? You're so happy that you decide to put a part of your investment, all the profits that you make, to the Guruji who was there at the time when you were successful, or to the temple who was there at the time of successful. And therefore, you sort of create a kind of a spiritual capital. And that is how religious institutions around the world are super successful. We'll have to tell them to mute.
Yeah, mute. I did it already.
Yeah. And this is important to understand. The reason I'm explaining this at the beginning is because then we understand where does mythology come in. So mythologies were stories, symbols, and rituals that every community has created in order to make sense of the world and life. So every culture in the world, whether it's China, whether it is Europe, whether it is India, all cultures have a story through which they try to make sense of life and the world. And there is no culture in this world which doesn't have a mythology. There is no culture in the world which will say that, for example, right now we have a very violent conflict happening in one part of the world. And if you look at both sides, they keep using the word justice. Now, justice is not a scientific concept. Justice is a mythological concept. It is an assumption that in this world, there is someone who will ensure there is fair play, there is fairness, justice. These words are cultural words. These are not natural words. They don't exist in nature. In nature, there is no concept of justice. Justice or nyaya, which we use in Hindi, would be something which is found in cultures. It is not found in nature. Nature functions on a very basic principle. You eat and you get eaten. So there is an animal which will eat and it will get eaten. So in Sanskrit, the word for this is jivo jivatsya jivanam. The living eat on the living. So let's say there is a tiger who eats the deer. He keeps eating the deer, but one day the tiger grows old. You will never find an old tiger in the jungle because the old tiger has been eaten by other animals. And thus the cycle of life continues because the eater is eaten. So when you consume something, if you were to use management language, you can say that someone who consumes something is in debt and he repays his debt by being consumed. So this is the foundational idea that functions in nature. Nature may, if there is anything organic things take resources from nature in order to survive. But in effect, while they nourish themselves, they become nourishment. So the tree will eventually be eaten by fungi and microorganisms. The animals will be eaten by other animals. So everybody, that which eats gets eaten. The consumer is also the commodity that is consumed. And this is the foundation of nature. And this is how nature is imagined. And this is what we look at nature. Now, culture is basically saying, I would like to consume, but I don't want to be consumed. So I will eat, but I don't want to be eaten. And that is how culture emerges. So culture is basically trying to control nature. We control fire, we control water, we control wind, we control trees, we control animals. So right now, for example, we are controlling the mountains and building tunnels through it to create passageways that will serve us. We want to enjoy that pleasure from consuming nature. But what is the price we are willing to pay to nature? And that conversation does not happen. That does not happen. And this is how mythologies emerge. Mythologies are trying to explain how the world functions. And Indian mythology functions in a particular way. Chinese mythology functions in a particular way. Western mythology functions in a different way. So let me explain the most powerful mythologies of the world before we come to Indian mythologies. So you cannot understand Indian philosophy or mythology without understanding global mythologies and global philosophies. The most powerful religious idea in the world is today the idea which comes from the Middle East and Europe and America. And there are two big ideas which come from there, which are really similar to each other. One is the religious idea that there is one God, you live one life, and if you live this one life, you have to live it the right way. In order to live the right way, you need to know how to live the right way, for which you have the right message. And the right message comes from the prophet. And the prophet, the God gives the right message to the prophet, and the prophet as a messenger shares it with us. And if we live our life as the message and as per the rules and commandments that are given by God, we will go to heaven. And after we die, there is going to be a judgment day where God is a judge. If you have aligned with the message, you will go to heaven. If you have not aligned with the message, you will go to hell. So you will, like in the Islamic world, this is a broad idea, and you find this in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So Judaism, for example, Islam, for example, you have the word, you have Allah. He has Paigambar, the prophets with the message. The final prophet is Muhammad. If he has these set of rules, if you align with the rules, it is called halal. If you break the rules, it is called haram. If you follow halal, you will go to Jannat, which is heaven. If you break the rules, that is in haram, you will go to Jahannam, which is hell. And that's the vision. And this vision is playing very great values placed on the idea of justice, which in Arabic is adl. And therefore, the idea of justice is central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Remember, the story of this begins with the breaking of rules. In Eden, God told the children, Adam and Eve, do not consume of this tree. And because they consumed of this tree, they have transgressed, they have broken a rule because of which they are suffering in this world. So now these are the stories that shape the Western world. Now, of course, we can argue that the Western world, not everybody is religious. What about the non-religious part of the world? When we use words like liberal democracy, capitalism, communism, socialism, all they have done is they have removed the idea of God, and they've replaced the idea of God with a secular idea of the state. So God is all powerful, state is all powerful. God is the only one who's allowed to be violent, state is allowed to be violent. The state is supposed to be the source of justice. The state is supposed to be from where you will get justice. So the state has all the power. State has all the wealth. So just as God is all powerful and everyone has to align to God in order to go to heaven, the state is all powerful and we have to align with the state in order to benefit from the state. And how is the state created? By the people. So the people create the state and the state then serves the state. This entity called the state or the nation state will give us a just world. So this is the broad idea that you see. And therefore, when you see the idea of the nation state, so when you say Bharat Mata or the idea of India, whatever you want to call it, this patriotism becomes a new form of religion. That this state is all powerful. It will take care of me. I have to submit to the state. And if I align with the laws of the state and serve the state, in exchange, the state will give me the justice. And that's the model that we work. Now, whether the state is giving you justice, the same question can be asked, does God give you justice? And you'll have lines like, Bhagwan ke ghar mein der hai, lekin andher nahi. The same thing is what the Supreme Court of India or the Chief Justice will say, that this justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied. And so you realize structurally, there is no difference between a secular state and the Western monotheistic mythologies which come. It is important to understand this because when people say that I do not believe in mythology and I'm secular, they really don't understand mythology. Because mythology is cultural truth. How do you imagine the world? None of us have entered this world with a manual which tells us how to live our life. And these stories tell us how to live our lives. And if most of the world, I'll give you an example of a practical behavioral aspect of this. The entire Muslim world will take a holiday on Friday because it is the Shabbat, it's a Sabbath. The gods rests on Friday. The Jews will rest on Saturday. All the Jewish people will have Sabbath. God rested on Saturday. All the Christians will rest on Sunday. Now, we have today something called a weekday and a weekend system. How did it start? And if you go to the history of it, you will realize that it started in America. And in America, the owners of the company were Christian and the workers were Jewish. The owners said, you will not work on Sunday. The workers said, we will not work on Saturday. And that led to union issues. And finally, a compromise was reached that both Saturday and Sunday will be declared a holiday. And that is how the concept of weekend emerged. In the Arab countries are so rich that they can afford to have a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday as a holiday. So these ideas are not rational. They come from a mythic cultural truth. India never had the concept of a week or a day of rest. This concept didn't exist. At best, you had special days. Some people would follow Purnima, that is the moon cycle, that is full moon, new moon, these Ekadashi, the 11th moon. So these are the ideas that India had, but India did not have this concept of every week regularly having an off day. It didn't exist. It didn't exist in China. China didn't have it. So China and India do not understand these systems. And in a global world order, you have to ask which mythology is to be followed. Friday holiday, Saturday holiday, Sunday, which we take for granted and we assume as secular, have really religious roots. So it's not as that we are not part of a mythic structure. The idea that we believe that the court structure will give us justice is again based on the concept of judgment day. Unless we understand these things about the global world order, we cannot appreciate Indian mythology. So because we try to make Indian mythology something exotic, because our parents don't teach us. We have no clue what our parents do. Our parents don't know what to do. They just go to the temple, they do some things. They're like cosplaying, wearing funny clothes, doing some rituals, and nobody really analyzes and asks questions. And of course, if you ask the questions, you are said, how dare you ask these questions? You're disrespecting. The Guruji will also get upset. And because remember, in most religions, it is based on faith, not on doubt, and therefore asking questions is not permitted. And when you talk of philosophy, people usually focus on the darshans, which were written by like yoga and Sankhya and Mimamsa and Vaisheshika, which are abstract ideas. But really, the common man in India connected with mythology, and his ideas really came from the rituals that he followed. And the two big epics of India are Ramayana and Mahabharata. That's it. Ramayana and Mahabharata are the big epics of India, and they really shape India in a very big way. The only character who is not there in Ramayana and Mahabharata who plays a very important role is Shiva and the story of Shiva. So if you take Shiva, Ram, and Krishna, you will realize that these are the three big ideas that come from mythology. But you must also be aware that when we talk of Shiva, we talk of someone who lives on Mount Kailas, and Mount Kailas is identified as a space north of Uttarakhand. When you talk of Krishna, you're talking of Mathura and Dwarka. These are all, one is in Uttar Pradesh and the other is in Gujarat. When you talk of Ram, you talk of Ayodhya, which is there in Uttar Pradesh. In other words, all these three things come from the northern part of India. So how did they become pan-Indian? How do Ramayana and Mahabharata become part of the whole of India? Odisha, Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka. And it is important to understand how these stories traveled from north to south and to different parts of India. But for you at a practical level, you have to ask yourself, what is Ramayana and Mahabharata primarily? And Ramayana and Mahabharata primarily are property disputes. And it's foundationally a property dispute. In Ramayana, the story begins with the queen saying, my son should be the king of Ayodhya, and hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah. You're audible.
Yeah. So when you look at Ramayana, the story of Ramayana begins with the queen saying that my son should be the king of Ayodhya. If you go to Mahabharata, it is a very clear property dispute where the Kauravas and Pandavas are fighting over Kurukshetra. And when you realize the story deals with kings and their claim over land and kingdom. So even when the Ramayana story, you have Vali and Sugriv fighting over Kishkinda. If you go to Lanka, you have Kuber and Ravan fighting over Lanka. So there's a constant battle over land, property, kingdoms, and that's the conversation that is happening both in the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And that is what makes it. So these are documents, and that is, one has to remember that when we use words like spirituality, they really exist in an economic and political framework. They're not outside an economic and political framework. And basically, if you want to have a simple understanding of spirituality, it is just saying that when you generate wealth and you generate power, how do you distribute it? It's about how do you distribute it? Do you consume? Is it for your own pleasure or is it for the pleasure of the world around you? If it is only for your own pleasure, then the spiritual quotient is less. If it is for the pleasure of others around you, then the spiritual quotient goes high. And who are these others is the question. Is it only your family, or is it also strangers to whom you are not related to? Now, that's the simplest definition I can give you of spirituality. And that's the question in Ramayana and Mahabharata. You have to ask yourself foundational questions. Is Ram ambitious in the Ramayana? And if you answer this question, since nobody's interacting over here, I'm just going to tell these things. But you will never find an answer to this question, because in Ramayana, Ram is not ambitious. Ram does not choose to be king. He has no agency. He has no agency. He is told you're the eldest son of the royal family, and therefore you must be king. The only agency he has is to say, I will not be king. And I will be, and then you can become a sannyasi. The only thing you can become is you become a monk. You have nothing else you can do. You can't say, I'll be a poet, I'll be a writer, I will be a soldier. No, you have to, you're the eldest son of the royal family. Your life is decided the moment you're born. Your gender has decided it, and the fact that you're the eldest son has decided. And that is how the story functions. In Mahabharata, the story gets complicated, because who is the eldest son? It's very difficult to figure out who is the biological son. So it creates a complication. So it's like a case study. In one case, it's very clear who should be king. It happens to be Ram. Ram happens to be a decent human being. He could have been a very bad human being. How would he have behaved if he was not a good human being? That is not to be challenged. The challenge is, you are the eldest son of the royal family, you are king. And these are the foundational questions to ask. What makes Ram king? And in the Mahabharata, since you don't know who is the eldest son, and there's a lot of lawyers fighting, and if you get lawyers like a Harish Salve, he can prove anyone is right depending on who pays him. So in a legal system, a good lawyer with enough money can prove anything. Can prove man is a woman is a man, Ravan is actually Ram. They can do anything. As we can see, the legal system is extremely malleable, ductile, flexible, and fluid. And that is what the Mahabharata is trying to tell us, that life is complex. And if you rely on rules and regulations, it depends on who is behind these rules and regulations. If the person behind the rules and regulation is a greedy bakasur who only wants to consume, he will always change the rules to suit himself. And that's the idea. So you can have any rules in the world. So it's very different from the Western model. Remember, the Western model is based on rules. So you have, if you follow the rules, you'll go to Jannat. If you break the rules, you will go to Jahannam. But look at Ramayana. The hero of the Ramayana is Maryada Purushottam Ram, someone who follows the rules. But if you read the Mahabharata and you look at Krishna, he's someone who breaks the rules. So on one side, you have Ram who follows the rules. The other side, you have Krishna who breaks the rules. Who is better? And they are told both are forms of Vishnu. And then, of course, we have to ask, as a scientist, if you want to ask yourself, why is he better? What is the purpose? Is it because my mother, my father, my guru told me that he's good? Or is there something in the internal logic of the story that tells us that Ram and Krishna are worthy of adoration? And then you look carefully at who are their enemies. Their enemies are also kings. So the enemy of Ram is Ravan. He's also a king. But Ravan is someone who breaks the rules and says, whatever I do is right. I don't care for the rules. And therefore, he doesn't respect boundaries of property. He just takes his brother's property and declares his brother's property is my property. He doesn't respect the boundaries of marriage. And he just abducts another man's wife and says, she shall be my wife. And therefore, you have a rule-making hero or a rule-following hero and a rule-breaking villain. Very simple. Ramayana that way is relatively simple. Look at the Mahabharata. If you look carefully at the Mahabharata, the Kauravas never break the rules. They are never breaking the rules. They're always aligned with the rules. They are just playing the rules. And they're saying, we didn't gamble the kingdom. You gambled the kingdom. And by law, you lost everything. And they constantly, when they go on exile and they come back, you will have Duryodhan saying, but well, according to the calendar, you have been caught before the 13th year of exile. There'll always be a legal conversation. It's a very legal Udyoga Parva. If you read Udyoga Parva, it's a constant legal battle. Basically, lawyers are playing their games. The spirit of the law has been forgotten. because the spirit of the law has been abandoned and the letter of the law. And that is why rules do not establish dharma. What is dharma? Dharma is when food is distributed, not consumed. That is the meaning of dharma. It's a very simple definition. Distribution of food rather than consumption of food. So Ram is constantly shown as distributing wealth and power, while Krishna is showing distributing wealth and power. Ravana is shown as consuming wealth and power. Duryodhana is shown as consuming wealth and power, distributing it only to those he considers his own. So distributing to your family is not dharma. Distributing it to everyone is dharma. How do you make room for your enemy? Now look at the conflicts in the world around. How do you make room for your enemy, or must you wipe out your enemy? Those are conversations that are there in India. If you don't like someone, will you still provide them with wealth and power? How do you decide? And that's the whole idea of dharma, because every animal seeking food. The only thing humans are different from is that not only can we consume, we can also distribute food. This is what other animals cannot do. Animals can offer their own body to be consumed. So when you read the Jataka tales, there are stories of animals which offer themselves as food. And that is considered to be a sign of wisdom. But if you look at the Ramayana and Mahabharata, they're saying, how much wealth do you generate and how much do you distribute? On what basis do you distribute? To whom do you distribute? And that is dharma. That's all there is. So at one end of the spectrum is Bakasur, the demon who will eat everything. He'll consume everything. And that is Bakasur. So when you see people saying, think big, stay hungry, stay foolish, these are things that management teaches us, right? Management teaches us penetrate the market, crush the competition, grab market share. Because you live in a dog-eat-dog world and it's a shark tank, the language is violent and it is celebrating the Bakasur who is constantly hungry. We don't use the word hungry anymore. We use the word ambition. So it's good to be eternally ambitious and consume. We never talk about wealth distribution and distribution of power. And that's the conversation that I think you should have when you're discussing values. Yeah. So that brings me to the end of my conversation. If you have any questions, we can look at the chat box. So Yash has asked a question, who should we idealize? Well, whoever you wish to idealize, there is no standard answer. So decide what you want to idealize. And what do you mean by idealize? Why do you want to idealize Ram? Why do you want to idealize Krishna? Are you Ram? What does it mean to be Ram in terms of this explanation that I have given? And do you want to, because both of them are distributing wealth and power rather than consuming wealth and power. And that's the idea. That's why they're called avatars of Vishnu. So they are explaining a concept. And the concept is very simple. Do you consume wealth and power or do you distribute wealth and power? So if there are no more questions, then we can sort of...
I think we can ask them, if you have questions, please raise your hand.
So there's a question from Dr. Tenaza Dubash. Business is ethics should be driven culturally or through the path of we follow right. Ethics is a theoretical subject. Ultimately, the successful businessman is any businessman who's super successful is always considered to be ethical as per his annual general report. And so ethics is a very complex definition. I just look because, a big industry will be polluting the ecosystem. So is it ethical to have a petroleum industry? Is it ethical to have a plastic industry? And yet for a country to progress, you need to build all these complicated polluting industry. So by definition, the structure of is destroying climate. The notion of ethics are therefore something that, these ideas really come from the idea of Jannat and Jahannam and the idea of commandment. Should I live right or wrong? Right and wrong is not a conversation in Chinese ideas nor in Indian mythology. It's always asking it all revolves around how do you divide resources? And right and wrong is a function of who do you define, how do you use those resources? So it's a very different conversation.
Professor Pattanaik, wants to ask something.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
From this extremely interesting perspective that you have outlined for us, where does Lord Shiva come? I mean, how do I see Lord Shiva in this notion of dharma?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, let's again, you have to look at it analytically. Shiva is described as someone who is covered with ash, and he sits on top of a mountain which is made of stone covered with snow, which means it is a land that cannot be used for agriculture. So Kailas Parvat is decided as a land that cannot be used for any economic activity. You can't have a pasture, so no animal husbandry. At best, you can say mining can perhaps take place over there, but otherwise it doesn't seem to have any economic value. And the idea, and is always described as Digambar, naked. That means he has no possessions. So Shiva really embodies the principle of someone who has outgrown hunger completely and says, I don't have to consume anything, which creates a dilemma. Because if you don't want to consume anything, will you still work? Will you still work and generate resources for others who are hungry? You may not be hungry, but will you generate resources for others? Is that because you're a living creature? And since life feeds on life, life needs life to survive. If you say that, I don't have any needs, I don't have any desires, I don't have any ambitions, which is fine. But what about the needs, ambitions, and desires of those around you? And therefore, if you look at Shiva's story, it is always about Shiva getting married to the goddess. And the goddess is trying to convince him to participate in social life, where he has to engage in the distribution of wealth and power. He may not consume wealth and power, but he has to engage in distribution of wealth and power. So it's very clearly the story. When you look at Brahma and his children, they are consuming wealth and power. They are not distributing. When you see Shiva, he is only distributing and not consuming. And between them are the avatars of Vishnu who are balancing the act of how much do I consume, how much do I distribute, and the complexities which evolve around the process of generation of wealth and distribution of wealth. So in Mahabharata, you'll have stories like destruction of a forest in order to build a city. So in order to generate wealth, there is a lot of violence, there is a lot of contamination of the ecosystem, and to destroy so many things in order to generate value. So Yash has asked me the question that, before that, there's a question from Rashmi. Compare Indian and Western ethical frameworks. So the Western ethical framework is about right and wrong. It does not consider context as important. Time as a context, space as a context, people as a context. Indian ethical framework will always have context under consideration. The simplest way to understand this is to watch a film or read a book called Les Miserables. It's a French play which asks whether rules for the rich and the rules for the poor should be the same. Because the law says everyone is equal before the law, right? But a rich man and a poor man, the rich man has access to good lawyers. The poor man has access to no lawyers. So in effect, the judiciary system is unfair and structurally wrong. And therefore, this idea of context is grossly missing in Western frameworks. And that is the big idea which happens in India. The Chinese also, context plays a very important role. Because the idea of equality has been popularized in recent times, it does not take context into consideration at all. So that is the big difference between Indian and Western ethical frameworks. Yash has asked the question about Shakti, Parvati, Durga. So the goddesses are usually shown now. When you are talking about a goddess, you're really talking about resources. So the wild nature is visualized as Kali, and domesticated nature from where you generate resources is considered Gauri. So Kali and Gauri. So they are the two forms of nature, the wild nature and the domesticated culture. From domesticated culture, you get wealth. So Lakshmi emerges. From domestic culture, you get weapons, power, technology. Durga emerges. From domesticated culture, you have the idea of a wife. Remember, wife is a cultural idea, not a natural idea. And therefore, Parvati emerges as the wife of Shiva. Or you have Saraswati, knowledge, because knowledge is a construct. Only humans produce knowledge. The production of knowledge happens within culture. Different types of knowledge, entertainment, arts, sciences, philosophy, which is transmitted through generations. So that is Saraswati. So Lakshmi Durga Saraswati represents the production of resources, power, technology, and knowledge from culture, which is embodied as Gauri. So that's how. So it's a very clean framework if you analyze it carefully.
Sir, how did the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam emerge, and how is that useful in the present day business context? And is it possible?
So it's a very, you see, people use it and it has really a very difficult meaning. Not what always beware whenever politicians say something. Remember, politicians are not the smartest people on earth. So they are power hungry and they use this only for impressing people. So I'm very wary of these things. Now, if all living creatures are children of Brahma, so all living creatures, jitne bhi jeev jantu hain, we are all born of Brahma. So effectively, we are all related to each other. Right? So we are all part of a family. And what is our inheritance? The earth is our inheritance. So the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam means the whole world, all living creatures are brothers and sisters. That means the plants, the trees, the animals, every human being. And all of us inherit the earth. The question is, over the inheritance, fights start to happen. And therefore, in this family, like in all rich families, you'll find property disputes happening. You go to the court, you'll see the richest property disputes. Every family, same like Vali and Sugriv fighting, like Garuda and the Nagas fighting, the Rakshasas and the Yakshas fighting. You have the snake and the mongoose fighting. Everywhere the brothers are fighting over the inherited property. Who should get? That is the meaning of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is my family and we hate each other. And that is that is what they are telling. Brahma's children are always fighting each other. The Devas are fighting the Asuras, the Yakshas are fighting the Rakshasas, the Rishis are fighting the Rakshasas, the Garuda is fighting the Nagas. So all of them, Vali is fighting Sugriv, Pandav is fighting Kaurav. Everywhere there's fighting happening because we are claiming one part of the earth as rightfully mine. And that's exactly what's happening in other parts of all the conflicts over the world, over land, over territory. This is border, this is my border, this is my land, this is your land, this is disputed territory. These are all indicators that we are brothers who can't share property.
Or we want exclusive rights.
We want exclusive. My brother is right. I am right. My family is right. ये मेरा इलाका है. ये मेरा धरती है. So it's my country. It is, we use the word Vasudeva, but we will prioritize the Indian over the non-Indian. And amongst Indians, we will prioritize my linguistic group over your linguistic group. And therefore, I always tell people, find out how many billionaires are there in our country and find out how many of them belong to one state. And that will tell you how the resources in our country are divided. Just do a Google search and you will get an interesting answer.
Any more questions, guys?
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
So if there are none, thank you very much, sir. Thank you for making it, and just hope to host you at MCHV once. And I think our students will enjoy the interaction.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for making it for us. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye. Bye.